Hey everyone, thank you for attending the Place Your Trades Network Spaces to discuss maritime shipping. This Spaces is brought to you by Trader8, which has a custom web app dedicated to trading CME Group's new daily option contracts, including indices, energies, metal, and now Bitcoin. You can also now trade these on the DOM on Trader8's main platform. It's a great way to get exposure to the futures market with limited risk. You can use the link in my Twitter stream to get the Trader8 app for free. I also do write a weekly blog and daily pre-market overview on markets that you can subscribe to at placeyourtrades.com. It's absolutely free. And then I'll be doing a summary of this episode with my key takeaways that'll be available for download as a PDF. If you're interested in getting this PDF, I'm going to put a link in my Twitter stream. And you can just click on that link, or you can visit placeyourtrades.com/spaces to sign up for it. And the PDF overview will be available and mailed out tomorrow to anyone that signs up. And now to introduce our guest, again, Sam is late. He's going to be a few minutes late, but Sam is the co-founder of TankerTrackers.com. It's an online research service that focuses on tracking seaborne flow of oil from leading producers. Since the incorporation of 2018, TankerTrackers.com is specialized in the tracking of dark transfers of oil. Clients consist of maritime insurers, financial institutions, governments, and the shipping sector. And then we have Sal Mercogliano. Dr. Salvador Mercogliano is an associate professor of history at Campbell University in North Carolina and an adjunct professor at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Marine Transportation from State University of New York Maritime College, along with a Merchant Marine Deck Officer's License, Unlimited Tonnage Second Mate, a Master's in Maritime History and Nautical Archaeology from East Carolina University, and a PhD in Military and Naval History from the University of Alabama. And he hosts the ever-popular What's Going On with Shipping on YouTube, so everybody should go and subscribe to that. Check that out. Go ahead and we got to start with Sal. So, what I wanted to ask you is, first, what is the container market telling us about global trade? So we know that global manufacturing is down pretty much across the board. Is this playing out in the shipping sector?
I think we're seeing a couple of things right now. And obviously, we're coming off of the massive influx of goods that came in during the supply chain crisis. So you've got an issue where there's a plus up within the warehouse sectors. So a lot of retailers, wholesalers have a lot of product that's been sitting there for a long time and either got in late for seasons and now being recycled, or just flooding into the secondhand marketplace. I also think you see a reordering of where goods are going and how they're being shipped. Remember, for a long time, at least on the U.S. side, we saw a huge disruption on the West Coast caused by the influx of goods, and then a myriad of issues. I mean, you had everything from transportation issues with Class 1 railways to drayage issues because of the port natures. You couldn't move a lot of cargo in and out of ports on the West Coast of the United States because of a lack of automation and efficiency in the ports. And then you had this looming ILW, PMA, Pacific Maritime Association strike that really led to a lot of goods shifting their routes. And what we saw was something that had started way back in 2017 just get accelerated, with goods going alternative routes. And in particularly, what we see is a lot of goods that were destined, for example, for the United States, shifted over to either the Panama Canal through the new Neo-Panamax lane of the Panama Canal that opened in 2016. Those are the new vessels you're seeing coming in huge numbers right now. That's that build that the shipping companies, the container liners, are spending their money on. Or onto the big ultra-large container vessels. These are the behemoth vessels. These are the Ever Givens and the Ever Alots, and the newest ones coming out by MSC that are going to Europe. And that's one of the things that kept the Europe rate propped up for such a long time, is because of that amount of goods that was going across that way. And again, the other element you're seeing here is a shifting because of the influx of money into the shipping companies. They're changing their fleets, and so what we're going to be seeing right now and witnessing is a wholesale revamping of the fleets. A lot of older tonnage is starting to go away. We're seeing that beginning of that scrapping that we knew was going to come, and at the same time, much more versatile ships are coming in that can be used on alternative routes. And then you have the always ever present issue of what is going to be the new rules being set by IMO regarding greenhouse gases. That's really the big variable that's out there right now.
Yeah, and that was kind of leads me to my next question is, when we had, IMO 2020 was supposed to be a big deal as far as disruption of the market, but it kind of turned out to be a dud. So can you walk us through this latest IMO meeting and kind of what it means for the shipping industry and what are the new regulations? And, is this going to slow down shipping?
Well, I mean, right now you're having the IMO having their MPAC, the MEPC 80 meeting right now. It's been going on for several days. And what you're seeing is the nations really trying to figure out what their regulations are going to be. If you go back to IMO 2020, what they were talking about was a 50% reduction in greenhouse gases based on 2008 limits set by 2050. But what we're seeing is an acceleration of that. Everybody wants to get accelerated on that. And the question is, how do you implement that? And what is that going to look like? And you're seeing several nations wanting to set up green corridors, really reduce those emission levels. The problem is going to be is the technology and the fuel. This is the big issue. It's great to be aspirational, but we're in that transitory period right now where we do not have the fuel that fits this. If you want to go completely green, then there's one solution, and that's called a sailboat, but that doesn't work. You can't have a 24,000 TEU sailboat. So the question becomes is how do you organize a system that allows you to do it? And that's what the discussion's been going on this week with the IMO. And I got to say, that meeting is classic IMO, because if you follow that meeting and you read the reporters who were there, it was a cluster. It was just, not enough seats, not enough power strips for everyone to plug in their laptops and their computers. And it's just a classic IMO meeting there. But what comes out of it's going to be really important, because what we're going to see is probably an acceleration in the push toward green, which means alternative fuels. The problem you have is we're sitting here in 2023, obviously. Ship lives are about 20 years long, 20 to 25 years long. And you're talking about setting a goal for 2050, which means there's got to be an intermediary set of ships before you get to the final set of ships. And everyone's leery about investing in ships and technologies that are going to be maybe outdated in 10, 15 years. And then you're stuck with a ship that you can't operate because the rules have changed. This is one of the reasons why you see companies like MSC buying a lot of secondhand vessels, because they can operate secondhand vessels because they have a short service life. Or you see Maersk really sitting back and holding off on purchasing a new replacement fleet, while other companies, CMA CGM, for example, and Yang Min and Hapag, are really investing in new vessels.
And do you foresee like nuclear being used at all in the shipping industry? I mean, obviously it's used in the military, but is it a viable option for regular commercial shipping?
Well, nuclear has always kind of lingered out there. You had the one case of it done by the U.S. with the Savannah back in the 1950s and 60s. Russia has done it with icebreakers. In terms of large vessels, it makes a lot of sense to use nuclear propulsion, because you do get it. The problem you have with nuclear power is it raises operating costs in certain ways. Engineers, crew members increases. Obviously, you don't have the fuel costs associated with it, but you do have an operating cost associated with it. The other issue you have is nations willing to have nuclear powered ships come in. I mean, if you look at the track record from the US, Britain, France, who operate nuclear powered vessels, It's been a good track record. There hasn't been a great deal of issues. On the flip side, if you look at Russia, you have issues with some of the plants. I think if you start getting toward the fusion side and start coming up with methods to promote these really, smaller nuclear power plants that generate great amount of power, enough for vessels, I think you come up with a great solution. Plus, it removes the fuel onus on the vessels, so it increases cargo output. It just is a general all-purpose. But I think until militaries really start using nuclear power more widespread, for example, the U.S. only uses nuclear power right now in aircraft carriers and submarines. Until they advocate more use of nuclear power as a propulsion system, I don't see it being a viable one, especially after Japan, Germany, and France really curtailed their nuclear power programs after Fukushima.
Yes, we're finding obviously that's been an issue in the West. So I think it definitely needs to get over kind of that mindset, which hopefully will happen. And then let's talk about like the peaks and dips of what is the current shipping cycle right now since the supply chain crisis after obviously COVID.
Sure. So, I mean, if you look at the container side of this, so almost every report, everything you read is comparing year to year. And the problem you have is 2021 and 2022 were just aberrations in terms of the container market because of what COVID did and the nature of what COVID was, changing everyone's buying patterns. You saw that the global shipping really had to accommodate excess capacity. And one of the big misconceptions I think that was out there was like a shortage of ships. There was no shortage of ships. There was plenty of capacity out there. There was tonnage out there. What we saw was reallocation of tonnage. You don't get 109 ships sitting off of LA and Long Beach from a shortage of ships. What you saw was a displacement. People moved their ships from routes, and that's why you saw new entrants into the Trans-Pacific market. It's why you saw SM Lines and CU Lines and a few other companies that don't typically operate in those spaces come into those spaces. But what you're seeing right now is that reordering and that reshuffling, so that those new entries are gone. They've shifted back into routes that they were on previous to that. And the big carriers are once more dominating the routes. And obviously the biggest news that has come out is the proposed split of one of the three big alliances. You got the three big alliances that operate the container shipping, but the split of the 2M alliance, the Maersk and the MSC, that's going to happen here in 2025. And that's largely because they have reached max capacity. Together, the two of them would exceed over 40% of the capacity of all of the container fleet. And so that's going to be a big adjustment. And the question is, do we see realignment? What we're seeing right now is really depressed rates on the Trans-Pacific route. And again, that had to do a lot with a decline in consumption. We again dropped back down to what was being consumed. We had a lot of excess sitting in warehouses and in the transportation and retail sector that had to be cleared out. We saw a downturn in manufacturing out of East Asia. And so what you saw was that movement. But the ships are designed now for a lot different carriage of goods. Ships were largely designed previous to be at max capacity. Now they're a lot more flex into them, and they can operate much more efficiently. We're seeing slow steaming being enacted more and more. We're seeing blanking of voyages, and I think what we're going to see here is this kind of ping pong movement of the container market until it once again settles back in. If you look at where we're at today, we're basically, if you take out what was COVID years, 2020 to 2022, we're basically right back on track where we were prior to that in 2019.
Sam is up. I don't know if he's ready to speak yet. He's let me know.
Hi, Tracy. I'm in the car. I'll be ready to speak in about a few minutes.
Okay.
Sorry about that. And I had technical difficulties with figuring out how to get the microphone work on Twitter. All right.
All right.
All right.
Talk to you in a couple minutes.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
All right. So we'll keep going on with Sal. So let's talk a little bit about, here, this, I wanted to ask, since we were kind of on the subject already. So at least in the United States, we're starting to see like total business inventory restocking rates accelerate. So, because they had built up a bunch of inventory. So does that bode well for shipping in H2, especially with Christmas season coming up? And are we seeing any pickup in orders yet?
So I actually think we're going to see something weird happen this year because of the way, I mean, normally this is the peak time. Normally what you're seeing is coming out of, Q2 into Q3. This is kind of the peak time where we just see this big, huge spike. It increases up through August and then starts to curtail after September. And then you see that kind of drop through February and then kick back up again. And I really think that this year is going to be a weird one because of the nature of the influx of goods and the fact that we're sitting here on such large inventories. I actually think we're going to see a very late spike all of a sudden happen. I think we may be post Christmas season where it actually booms back a little bit sooner because of this kind of whiplash we're going to see take place. Because I think right now everybody's clearing everything out. So you're seeing a lot of sales, a lot of again, you got to look at the retail side and the wholesale side. What's being moved right now? And obviously the economy is the one thing that has driven this a lot with a looming recession, with a downturn, with the inflation jacked up the way it is. People are not buying as much, but you also have to remember too, when people have less money, they tend to buy more goods that are cheaper, and that is actually an influx in shipping usually. And so I think we're going to see a right sizing here of the container market. I just think we're going to not follow a pattern. We've never looked at a post spike pattern like we had with COVID. COVID threw everything out the window when it came to really looking at the container rates. That's why when you look at companies like Zim, it's very hard to see where Zim is going right now. But Zim is in the process of changing out their entire concept of operation. Zim was a company that owned one ship and leased 100 ships. Now they're changing. They're buying some ships, building some ships. So that has changed their concept, and it's also changed their material outlook when it comes to an investment strategy. If people are looking at them, they don't look like they're performing the way they normally do, but that has to do with them buying ships right now because they were really at the mercy of the market for getting ships. You have a lot of companies that lease ships from these non-owner operators, these NOOs. And those leases are good through 2024, 2025. When those leases go away, then you're going to have a lot of companies going to have to relook at what their fleets look like. And I think Zim is a good example of that. Everybody loves to follow Zim because of the huge influx and peak it had when it went from its IPO up all the way up to the top. But again, there's very few investment companies you can jump into in the container sector. So Zim tends to focus a lot of people on it. And people tend to think Zim is kind of the indicator for where the container market is, when in truth, it's on the smaller side of the companies. And it's a much different type of operator than the other ones.
And since we're talking about fleets or having to order them, what's kind of the ship construction order book looking like? I know, for example, 2022 for LNG tankers is kind of lagging 2020, or 2023 is lagging 2022 as far as orders are concerned, because everybody went crazy and ordered LNG tankers after the energy crisis last year. But do you think this will pick up? Do you think LNG tankers will pick up new supply or pick up in H2 2023? And also, kind of does the order book look like, for the other sectors, container, dry bulk, et cetera?
Well, I think if you look at the container sector, obviously it's as full as it's going to get. I don't see really a lot more going in. But again, this goes back to IMO and the fuel issue of what we're seeing in that production. You're seeing some orders take place, but nowhere near the scale that we saw. I just saw Yang Min make an order for some container ships. you're really seeing, and what you're looking at, what they're ordering tend to be these kind of Neo-Panamax vessels and about the 7,000 TEU size feeder vessels is really what you're seeing coming in on the order books right now for the container ships. In terms of tankers, that's the next market that's going to kick, I think. I think obviously tankers have been so down, so depressed for so long that if they can get a little bit of lifeblood into them, they're going to have to get some tonnage in there because of the fact that there's so little out there. We're seeing it pressed again because of what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, and Samir can talk about this much more authoritatively than I can. But you got vessels running much longer distances and their ton miles that you're going to have to see that movement. We've seen some of the order book change from containers to tankers. And so we've seen some of that movement. But I think it's really important to note, too, that one of the things we're seeing in ship construction right now is costs are going up tremendously. We're seeing the inflation hit. So it's getting much more expensive to build ships. The time order is increasing. I think we went from like 2.5 years to 3.5 years. So again, and one of the biggest things is we've seen this huge reduction in the number of shipyards around the world, about a 40% reduction in shipyards since 2009. And so there's just the availability of shipyards to do this too. And at the same time, you have a nationalistic issue going on with China trying to underbid and really cut out Japan in the large area. So Japan is really looking for business. They've been out there hunting for a lot of building right now to fill their order book, because if there's a nation out there with their yards in a depressed state, it's going to be Japan right now.
When speaking of, what happened to the U.S. shipbuilding market?
Well, that market has never been that great for obvious reasons. It's been an extremely expensive market to get into. Where you're seeing, one of the areas that we're watching right now, and I think it's an area to watch going forward, is in the offshore wind industry. We're seeing that industry really pick up. And if you look at building in the U.S. right now, that's where you're going to start seeing some building. Because of the closed nature of the U.S. market, because of the Jones Act, you're going to see several vessels being built around the world for that. And understand, this offshore wind market is very unique because of the type of ship you need, the construction method involved. There's a worldwide shortage of these type vessels out there, along with the mariners to operate them. But that's an area that's going to be interesting to watch, because a lot of people have experience from the offshore oil drilling market, and they saw what happened with that. So there's going to be a lot of experience going in. I think on the U.S. side, you're going to see some major yards. NASSCO out in San Diego, for example, which is building Navy tankers right now, will transition over to building offshore wind vessels. I think you're going to see that marketplace develop. You're going to see a couple of specialty yards. I think in Europe especially, you're going to see some yards shift over. The Dutch will do it. The Finns will probably shift over to that to fill that, especially now that China has begun building cruise ships. That has a potential to endanger some European yards from building cruise ships if China decides to start pumping them out the way they pump out container ships and tankers. So I think that sector is going to be a good one. But the biggest issue is the amount of support that nations like China, Korea, and Japan give their shipbuilding sectors. I mean, in Korea, shipbuilding is 4% of the national economy. The U.S. doesn't come anywhere close to that in that sector. So they get a lot of support for it. I think China, over a period of 8 years, dumped about $132 billion from government funds into their shipbuilding sector. In that same 8-year period, the U.S. provided $77 million. So it's a concept of national strategy, and China, Japan, Korea have that kind of national strategy for building ships, and that's why it's much more conducive to do it. Although they all have problems in terms of labors. I thought one of the most interesting stories that kind of was under the radar last year was Korea dumped $2 billion into their shipbuilding industry, but at the same time they had to make new laws to allow basically foreign workers to come in to work in their shipyards, because they couldn't hire Koreans to work in their shipyards. So they were trying to get Vietnamese in, trying to get Filipinos in to come in and do it. And one of the countries I think to watch in the development of their shipbuilding industry is going to be a nation like Vietnam and the Philippines. I think you're going to start seeing them start trying to get some of that sector.
We should try to get some of that sector, but that's good information out at the very least. And then, so obviously, there are a lot of investors, I'm sure, in this spaces right now, and so of course we need to ask a little bit on the investment side. So, looking at this from an investment perspective, what do you kind of see as the strongest sector right now for shipping, and what should we be keeping our eye on? And obviously, you don't have to name names if you don't want to, but sectors would be cool.
Yeah, I mean, again, I go back to I'll say again, I think that offshore wind sector, companies that are going to get involved in offshore wind right now have a great potential. I think if you start looking at them, and there's a batch of them out there, and I won't name names because there's quite a few of them out there. But I do think that in the offshore wind sector, you're seeing companies that are making their inroads off Europe. Plans in the United States are going to be to see wind increase even more so offshore. And so that's definitely an area to look at. I've been following more than anything else right now, obviously, tanker sector. I think that's kind of the most interesting one to watch in terms of tankers. There's so much going on. And if you look at the rates increase over the past 5 years, and there are certain companies that are out there that have been doing extremely well. There's others that aren't, and you got to be careful of them, because there's quite a few companies out there that have been doing a lot to basically make money for themselves at the expense of their investors. So I got burned on a few of those myself. So I'm always careful about that. But in the tanker sector, again, it's a volatile industry, and one of the things I talk about, and I hear people talk about quite a lot about this, is you're going to make your money very quickly, and you got to know when to get in and when to get out. And unfortunately, that's the market looks like one that's always an enticing one, and it's really hard to get out. The other sector that I've watched really carefully has been the reconstruction of the cruise line sector. It's one that doesn't get a lot of attention sometimes. But you just saw Carnival stock, for example, pop back up from almost $8 a share up to about $20 a share. And right now, the cruise sector went through a huge problem. If you look at the three big with Norwegian, RCL, and Carnival, they were booming. They were booming along in 2020 until COVID hit. And then they had some really poor strategy decisions. They made just some awful decisions, thinking that COVID was going to be a short-term event and not putting their ships in a cold layup. And what we saw happen is now the market, they are looking not very profitable at times, and this has been I would argue, a deception. One of the things that they have done is they deferred a lot of voyages, a lot of cruises, so that if you bought your cruise to go out in the midst of COVID, you still have that cruise. It's just been pushed out for a later time, which was good for the cruise companies because they were able to keep that money. So they had the money from the cruisers. They were able to sit on it for a year or two. But the problem is they're not getting as much income, even though they're at capacity now, and you're seeing full cruises out there. You're seeing the cruise lines talk about the fact that, hey, we're running back, normal schedules. But if you look at their profitability, it looks down. That's because the people who are cruising now, about a third to half of them paid for their cruise a year or two ago. And so you don't have that fresh influx of money. But what the cruise lines are doing right now is when you go on those cruises, they're selling you the next ones, and they're selling you the next ones. And what has really been an issue for them has been a huge new vessel replacement program. They're building ships like crazy. And so that tonnage is coming out online. They've had to sell some of their old tonnage. If you look at the ships that were getting scrapped, it was cruise ships. Old cruise ships were getting sent in, and in the past, old cruise ships would go to other markets, off-brand names, and they would operate in these short little rounds, 2 to 3 day voyages, go off and work in areas. Now what they're doing is basically being recycled. and these new vessels are coming in. So I think that's a sector that's really interesting. It's a very hard sector to read, and I think that's the problem. But if you're in for a long-term investment, cruise ships have been at the bottom here for the past year, but now they're making that climb back up. They're really coming up out of the trough.
Fascinating. Hey, Sam, are you ready?
I sure am, Tracy.
Fantastic. All right, so we're gonna move.
Sam was probably talking to the New York Times. That's why he didn't come with us.
Sal, I'm a big fan of your work. I follow you on YouTube. I'm a patron as well, and I seriously recommend everyone else to follow Sal on his YouTube channel. It's amazing how much knowledge this man has about the shipping industry, and I'm there as a student, Sal. I got to tell you, I really love the information that you sit on. For sure.
So you're very nice, and I am a huge follower of you and TankerTrackers too.
Thank you.
If you haven't read that New York Times piece, I strongly recommend everyone go read it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
This is like a giant loving. Right?
and no better host than Tracy. For sure. So,
second that.
All right, so let's move over to specifically kind of your sector of the shipping world, Sam. So first, we got to talk about this, Russian seaborne exports, because that's what everybody's been talking about. A little bit about, their shadow fleet. Obviously, we had a question about that on Twitter today. Yeah. So kind of give a background on people that don't really know kind of what's going on with the Russia situation, and then we'll kind of get into a little bit more of the nuances.
Sure. Okay. So a little background on at least Russia for their part. Let's see. Late last year, the European Union, together with the G7, decided that to impose an embargo on Russia's crude oil shipments and refined product shipments, and meaning by sea. Now, the EU had already by then cut back a lot of the pipeline imports from Russia in terms of oil and gas. And so a lot of that oil that was supposed to be moving by pipeline ended up going out by sea. So when I look at the chart of the maritime shipments, the seaborne shipments, you can see that it's only been in a linear path heading upwards. Although it's been zigzagging a little bit lately, but nonetheless, it's quite strong. I mean, if we look at the past few months, it's averaging around 4 or so million barrels per day of just crude oil alone. So it's quite strong, and it will probably continue to be going forth because of the fact that this is the one revenue source that they can easily attain these days, given that everything else is very difficult to export. And so there is a price cap that was imposed, said by the G7, and the purpose of that is to limit the amount of profit per barrel. So the price cap was set to $60 a barrel. Now, I know a lot of people were very skeptical that this would go through, but it did. And the reason for that is because in order to transport oil, you need to have insurance on the cargo and the vessel. And so these insurance policies have to be able to cover about $1 billion in compensation. So, for instance, if a vessel shows up on the coast of China and does a spill, like we've seen before in the past, then somebody obviously has to pay for that. And so if China doesn't want to accept vessels without insurance, then they have to get insurance, obviously. So when the insurers are the ones that are able to call the shots, then it has to be a maximum of $60 per barrel. And if you don't use the 95% of the world's oil is being moved on tankers that are insured by Western institutions, quite large ones at that. And we serve some of those clients as well with the work that we do. And if you don't use any of those insurers, then you have to go with the smaller ones, but they don't have that big risk coverage in case of a spill. So that's the issue. So options are quite limited, and therefore you have a pretty good compliance on the $60 price cap. Now, this $60 per barrel is mostly coming out of the the medium sour grades of oil, meaning the ones that are have a higher sulfur concentration, and they are produced in the Ural mountain range of Russia, and then it is exported by several ports in western Russia. So you got the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea primarily. There's also light crude oil, or light sweet crude oil, meaning it has low sulfur concentration, that's being exported from Arctic and the Pacific terminals. Now the light sweet oils, they cost more than $60 a barrel, and there the shipper has to find another solution for insurance. But we've also found cases of non-compliance, or basically violations of the embargo, and where the shipper would still use the Western insurance that was intended for sub $60, and they'll go ahead and move oil that it costs north of even $70 or $80 at times. So Russia does have the ability to, of course, obfuscate its transfers out of Russia. I mean, you're going to have smuggling. It's going to happen wholesale in some cases, but mostly it's isolated initially until you find the huge discovery. And that's what we stumbled on in the port of Kozmino in Russia's Pacific realm. And what we found out was we tracked a lot of tankers that were spoofing, meaning that they were falsifying their stated destination or stated location over AIS, which is the automatic identification system. It's a transponder that each vessel has, and this vessel updates in real time the location of the vessel. But in this case, with spoofing, you can actually misrepresent your location. So they were pretending to go to, for instance, Japan. Instead, they went to Russia, and we could confirm that with things like satellite imagery and social media. And that's also an investigation that we did together with the New York Times, as Sal mentioned. And what we've discovered was that there's about $1.1 billion worth of oil that was being smuggled out of the country while using, in this case, U.S. insurance. So I've also looked at other parts of Russia, and I'm seeing a lot more AIS shenanigans, especially now as of the announcement that Russia would cut back not just production but exports. They clearly stated it will be exports. Now, if they're talking about 500,000 barrels per day in cut, I could believe that to an extent, but I'm not going to go believe it's entirely true either. So I would anticipate between 200 to 250,000 barrels might be attempted to smuggle out with AIS manipulation. So I've discovered a lot of transactions lately to indicate that they are up to something, and I'm going to keep our clients abreast of that on a regular basis. But yeah, Russia is pretty much following the same playbook as what we've seen with Iran and Venezuela since 2018 and 2019 respectively. And but what I can say is that it's not at the level in terms of percentage as it would be with Iran and Venezuela, because there most of the exports are obviously obfuscated, whereas in Russia only a few are. But that few is enough, actually, if you put the numbers together. Then what we have to consider is that around 1/6 of the tankers that are moving Russian oil right now are known violators of sanctions imposed on Iran and Venezuela. So after having graduated from those two markets, they have moved over to transport Russian oil because there's so much more business for them to do there. And, there's more money to be made because in these lengthy trips to China and even India. And they can do it transparently. And, they won't do it with any of the large insurers, but they'll find an alternative to that. And a lot of that is also covered by the Russian insurance company, Ingostrach. So the playbook is pretty much similar. AIS manipulation. Very rarely do you see an instance where they actually switch off the transponder for very lengthy periods. I've seen several cases where a vessel is offline in the Black Sea for about 5 weeks, and then I find it with satellite imagery in just a matter of days after it goes offline. And then we have photos of the vessel going in and out of the Black Sea, and we can see how fully laden it is with cargo, and then we can calculate how many barrels are on board doing it that way. So I do anticipate more shenanigans, and we'll keep a close watch on that.
And then as far as, as far as their fleet is concerned, because we heard a bunch about how they're buying all these older ships, right? Because they couldn't ship it on, they couldn't use Western vessels. And so is there a concern in the market about these older ships and or are they looking to like upgrade any of these?
I think upgrading is quite difficult, but I do see that the market for these vintage vessels is quite a hot one right now. You've got vessels that are 20 years old, including, the VLCCs, the super tankers, which are they don't actually use them for exporting directly from port in Russia, but they would use them in the ship-to-ship transfers on the receiving end. So, for instance, you'd have 3 smaller vessels, size of Aframax class size, which is about 100,000 metric tons, or around 730,000 barrels, would depart Russia, 3 of them, and they would go down to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, almost middle, like just 800 kilometers west of the Azores, and they would hand over their cargo to one single VLCC, which is registered in China, and it was usually around 15 to 20 years of age, and maybe has been paid for about $30 to $40 million in some cases. Now, back in 2020, when we were looking at the Iranians using outsourced vessels, back then the vessels were only costing about somewhere as low as $18 million, if I remember correctly, for these VLCC super tankers. So they were very affordable. And, these are vessels that were intended to go to the scrapyard at age 15, and then somebody made a final bid, in the last minute, $1 million over the bid before that, and they managed to get the vessel before being sent to the chop shop. After that, they instill new life into it. They breathe new life into it for another few more years. And I see these tankers going back and forth to Venezuela and Iran, just like on a ferry shuttle basis. Constantly going back and forth. And their MO of how they do these transactions is pretty consistent from time to time. They do sometimes surprise me, but we're ahead of them these days because we have a database to visually identify all of them. That's what we did last year. We spent an entire year just cataloging every single tanker on the planet that is of a specific size range. And so right now it would take us anywhere between a few seconds to just a few minutes at most to identify a vessel. And then we wrap that up in a notification for our clients who are the maritime insurers, financial institutions who also have vested interest in shipping. Then there's shipping companies, and there's governments like navies and so on that are also interested in this information. So I think they're following pretty much the same handbook as the Iranians came up with when they also did their transfer knowledge to Venezuela back in 2020. And even back then, the Russians were involved in transporting Venezuelan oil. I see that a lot. And also Iranian oil. Yeah.
And then wanted to move on to, I can't, since I have to bring it up since it happened today. We had shots fired at a tanker. I guess the U.S. Navy intercepted two tankers that Iran was going after. Apparently, one was a Greek-owned, U.S.-managed tanker. Forgot the name of it. But so obviously, I mean, we've been seeing a lot of these incidences with Iran since, 2019, really kind of right after, the JCPOA was torn up. So, I mean, should we be worried about this, or is this just regular Iranian shenanigans? And then what are some other geopolitical risks that we should be taking into account right now as far as the oil market is concerned, geographically speaking?
Honestly, I think the Middle East risk factor is kind of overblown. I mean, we've seen everything happen in this sector. We've seen an attack on Saudi oil infrastructure, and that was blown off within a matter of days. But when it comes to these assaults on tankers, I don't think there's too much to concern about in terms of the market. And also Iran, if you get these hot-headed politicians every now and then who say that they'll shut down the Strait of Hormuz and so on. But the thing is that their biggest client is China, and China is also buying from the rest of the buffet. And you got Saudi oil, you got Kuwaiti oil, you got Iraqi oil, and all those countries have to be able to export through the same strait. Now, if Iran was to close it down, it would infuriate China because they wouldn't be getting their oil from anywhere else. B, it would also provoke possible UN sanctions, not just the US, but UN. And that would be a very harsh penalty on Iran. So I don't think they would go as far as doing that. Yes, they may try to demonstrate their use of force, like over a matter of hours and so on, but it's nothing that can last for several days, because obviously that would create a lot of problems with Beijing. And that's what I think. Regarding today's incident, I mean, I haven't had time to look further into it, but I have read that this VLCC, which they have fired at, the Richmond Voyager, was actually coming from Ras Tanura, Saudi Arabia, which is kind of awkward given the fact that Saudi Arabia and Iran have now opened up, diplomatic contacts again. They have embassies in each other's countries operating again, and so that is a bit awkward. But this is something that we actually do factor in every summer happening. Incidents like these.
And then is there any area you specifically think that people aren't really watching that there is geopolitical risk, or just all the same places?
I definitely
all the usual suspects.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think for Iran, it's pretty consistent from year to year. We expect these assaults to happen. Meanwhile, their exports are up, but they're not dramatically up. I mean, for those who have been only following their exports on AIS, they will see a dramatic surge in exports because, their vessels are not coming back online. But the reason why their vessels are doing so is because they have a fleet of, let's say, 39 VLCC supertankers, which can combined carry around 78 million barrels of oil. Now, a majority of those were offline for several years since 2019, and that's because they were storing gas condensate, okay, in Iran. Now, the reason why they do that is because Iran, Qatar, and Russia are three of the world's largest producers of natural gas. And in the Gulf itself, you have this body of water. It's divided between Qatar and Iran, and they share this huge gas field, which even in night imagery you can see it just lights up the whole Gulf. And with the gas that's being shipped out by Qatar as LNG, whereas Iran doesn't have an LNG export infrastructure. They're just burning that excess gas or piping some to shore, but they're burning a lot of it. And up with it comes gas condensate. And, several 100,000 barrels can be produced in a day. And they have nowhere to put it on shore. They don't have the storage tank space for it. So they have to put it on vessels. And they've now started incorporating more into their refining and even blending with crude oil and so on, just find venues for this liquid. Now, they had to pack in about over 60 million barrels onto vessels during the sanctions because there was no market for this stuff. And then finally in 2020, they started exporting it to Venezuela, and they shipped out something like 25 to 28 million barrels of to Venezuela, and then the rest to China. And now I also see a lot of exports going to the UAE. And in doing that, using their own fleet, they freed up the fleet now. Okay, so that fleet is on AIS again, intermittently, but it is shipping crude again, which is interesting. So their crude oil exports are only marginally higher for us. I'm understating. It's year on year, we're seeing some like 42% increase, but the industry is seeing somewhere between 60 and 80%, because they don't track the way we track, which is, the combination of satellite imagery and other sources and so on. So they had to use an outsourced fleet comprising a lot of mostly smaller vessels, Aframax and Suezmax vessels, and even a lot of VLCCs. But those Aframaxes and Suezmaxes have moved on towards Russia, Russia and Venezuela. So now Iran is shipping a lot using their own VLCC supertankers. So they're busy again. And so exports this year are higher, but they're definitely nowhere near where they were pre-sanctions.
And then we'll move on. Let's move on to China now. So we have seen China crude oil imports surging, and so everybody's saying, obviously they have more, or I should say, they're just not caring as much about hiding Iran and Venezuela imports anymore. But there a lot of people are saying they're buying all this, crude oil more than they ever have before. I think they hit their all-time high last month. So is this all just going into storage? Is there any way to tell this? Because a lot of people are saying, oh, it's just all going into storage.
Right. So China does buy the dip when it comes to prices. They take on a lot of oil into storage. They're able to very rapidly build out new storage tank farms. Before even Google Maps has them, the farm has already been built. In 1 year, I remember seeing something like 250 million barrels of storage space being added in just 1 year. Imagine Cushing is what, 80, 90 at most? And here we're talking about 250. And so they're able to pack a lot into storage when prices are low. And, they'll import from everywhere. And of course, the oil that does arrive from Iran and Venezuela is labeled as Malaysian oil. It even says Malaysian blend, and that's nonsense. Nobody blends the oil. It's just PDF templates that they print out, bill of lading saying that it's Malaysian, because the ship-to-ship transfer happens in Malaysia's EEZ, which is the body of water that Malaysia has coverage over, and the ship-to-ship transfers there happen on a daily basis. I'm tagging these vessels in satellite imagery, usually 2 to 3, sometimes 4 or 5 pairs of vessels receiving mostly Iranian oil, and then they make that delivery to China aboard vessels which have good paperwork, and a lot of them are Western insured even. So that happens, and so China will pack more oil into storage while Europe in particular is down, meaning consumption is lower here. With this inflation, it is expensive enough for people to vacation or holiday in their home country, let alone going abroad and spending all that money. So I think the Chinese, who were really looking forward to ramp up their own production, because they felt like, okay, now after COVID we're coming back, and then all of a sudden this whole thing with inflation happened and interest rates rising, so that kind of put them in a bad spot. So what do they do now? They are able to buy oil on the cheap and just put it into storage.
Well, that makes sense. And then I just had another couple questions here before we'll do the final round of questioning. But for as far as like crude, or as far as crude oil global flows, what are some of like the major differences you're seeing since the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Meaning, is there more going east or
For U.S. oil?
west?
Did you say U.S. oil?
No. Just as far as total crude global flows, what are some of the differences that you're seeing since the invasion of Ukraine? Because we know that's kind of upended the market a little bit.
Well, so the largest maritime importer of Russian oil, it's mostly, I think it's India, because China has a combination of maritime and pipeline. So there's a pipeline that flows from Siberia into northern China, which is around, I don't know, I mean, it varies from report to report, but I think it's somewhere like 600 to 700,000 barrels on average per day, which are coming in. And then on top of that, you add the 1.2 to 1.3 or more barrels that come in by sea. And most of that is, the light sweet oil coming from Cosmino. And then there are, of course, the cases where you can see medium sour grades going all the way around Europe and then through the Suez Canal into China. So yes, the two top markets are China and India, as we all predicted before all this happened. And then there are some other up-and-comers, but still low volume. It would be like UAE. It would even be Saudi Arabia. Turkey is I think the third position because of its proximity within the Black Sea, although which is really odd because they actually do import a lot from the Baltic Sea as well. So there has been a shuffle, but I think at the end of the day that's all it is. That all it is in the oil market. It's a game of musical chairs, and I think when it comes to a shortage of oil, I don't think Europe would suffer because Europe has the ability to pay. It's the other markets which are going to suffer. The countries in the developing nations which are suffering the most, and what they can't really import anyway is crude oil. They need refined products in low volumes like diesel and so on. So Russia is helping out countries like Cuba with oil, also Sri Lanka, which is a failed economy, and they've been assisting them as well. And they're trying to basically bring in more buddies, and in case they have to ever have a vote at the UN for any reason, and that happens every now and then as well. That's why they've also been pushing for the grain initiative quite enthusiastically initially.
That makes sense. And then with these Saudi cuts, or actually it's more than Saudi Arabia, right? With these voluntary cuts coming online in July, this month, what do you think, where do you think that this is actually, we're going to have these cuts? Do you think it'll actually, two-part question, do you think it'll actually affect exports? And where do you think they are going to send less to, if so, meaning, will the United States see less?
Right. So it's very interesting because there's like one of the few times where actually, where they bring up exports, and this is an organization that's called the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, right? And they never talk about exports. They always talk about production. And you have the fact that in Russia consumption is down. So yes, they produce a lot, but they export more, and they gain more from exporting than consuming. I'm talking about just the domestic consumption, not the actual refining for exports. I'm talking about just domestic consumption. And I think what we'll see is that Saudi Arabia will, of course, be able to slow down their exports. But as it always is with Saudi Arabia, they have to be the ones that make the drastic moves. Otherwise, the organization doesn't look like it's doing anything, because the other countries can't do as much. We're talking about some countries which are looking at slashing maybe a few thousand or a few 10,000 barrels per day, and that really isn't much compared to what Saudi Arabia can do overnight. So Saudi will have to make some big moves. But then again, Saudi does, its usual zigzagging. They're expert. They say one number and we see a different number. I mean, when I say we, it's not just us, but other trackers. I've asked around, and nobody ever has the same number which Saudi Arabia says. It's always like off by several months. So then, what really concerned me, though, however, was this Bloomberg story about the snag in the Red Sea, where you had like a huge floating storage buildup. And I did look at that, and it reminded me of what happened in 2020 when there was exact same scenario playing out. And what the story didn't look at was what was happening on shore. They were only talking about the tankers that were anchored off the Sumed, which is the Suez Mediterranean pipeline in Egypt. So you have two ends of the pipeline. One is in the Red Sea, the other is in the Med Sea. And in the Red Sea, there was about 10 VLCC super tankers packed with Saudi oil. So it's about 20 million barrels. Now, what they didn't look at what was happening on shore. And I looked there and I saw that the storage tanks, which housing around 18 or 19 million barrels, their lids were completely high up. So they were packed with oil. And when the oil leaves the tank, the lid will drop. So I didn't see any shadows a few weeks ago. It was completely high. Then I looked at the other end of the pipeline in the north, and I saw that the tanks weren't that full there. So there seems to be either congestion issues within the Sumed, possible pipeline issues, but it seemed more like it could be a demand issue, because I saw that the exports coming out of the Med Sea side weren't as high as they were in 2020. During 2020, when prices were down, everyone was buying for storage. And in this case, they're not. So it seems to be a demand concern rather than a supply issue. That's what I think is going on.
Interesting. Very interesting. All right. So since we're coming up on the hour, it's the final round question, and it's the same question for both of you. And we'll start with Sal. Sal, tell us either something that you wanted to talk about that we didn't cover, or again, what should we be looking at as investors in this industry, over the next 12 to 24 months, say. And I know that you covered that with specific areas, but if there is something that we, didn't talk about in the broader sense.
Yeah, I think in the shipping market, one of the things is knowledge. I mean, it's very hard to discern where, because tomorrow something happens, a ship gets stuck in the Suez, something happens, and all of a sudden the market spikes in one direction or another. And that's what makes the shipping market, for me, an attractive one to look at, because you never know. I mean, you have this long-term investments you can put into, or these really quick short-term that could produce a lot of profit very quickly. And it's really watching it very closely. And I think one of the things that's different today than has been in the past regarding the shipping market is the access and availability of information much faster, quicker, almost real time. I mean, you just heard Samir talk about the fact that he's been able to track literally 4,000 tankers around the planet. That's something that didn't exist a few years ago. And so I think for those looking to delve into the marketplace, especially on the shipping side, and again, you have your choice with the bulk, with container, with tankers, with LNG, with cruise lines. Is really watching that information, is going right to the sources and seeing where that information is going and thinking about that connection. I mean, what Samir just talked about with the tankers in Saudi Arabia is so key, because we tend to look at the water and just focus on it, but need to understand that ships are just a conduit for trade on land. You need to understand what is going on the shore side. You know, I sat there and started my process of doing this by looking solely at ships, but now I'm watching rail, I'm watching the warehouse sector, I'm watching trucking rates. And understand that you got to really look at the bigger picture. It doesn't mean you have to spend every last minute doing this, because fortunately there's a lot of great sources out there that you can tap into and follow that do this on a fairly consistent basis with some good results all the time. But whenever there's a hiccup, whenever there's a disruption, I always look at okay, how's this going to impact shipping? What's going to be the issue? You know, I talked about Russia, Ukraine disrupting ocean shipping before the invasion took place, and it's not because I'm Nostradamus and I'm a really smart guy, because I'm not. It's just because that's the next logical issue. It's going to be that this is going to have an impact on the bulk sector because of Ukraine growing a lot of crops, and that's, I would argue, what people need to be watching, is make those connections. Get yourself, you know, a couple of good sites, get yourself a couple of good sources, start following it, follow a couple of key trading areas and key stocks, and then you'll see where the patterns are developing and where they're forming. And again, don't get an attachment to it, because you make money fast in the shipping sector and then you get out.
I think that is excellent advice. Thank you. And Sam, you something that we didn't talk about that you wanted to bring up, and or some advice for investors when looking at these markets.
Yeah, something that I thought about was that tanker market itself, they're not. It seems like I don't think they're building it as fast as I'm seeing tankers switching over to the dark side. We have, over the past several years now, tracked up to 600 tankers. About 10%, almost 10% of them have been scrapped. So operationally, we're talking about 540 or 550 tankers that are still moving around, mostly uninsured and so on, or they're using other sources. And so I think there's going to be quite a crunch for tankers that are clean, that have a clean slate, clean record, because of this whole issue with Russia, Venezuela, and Iran. So I think that is. I mean, I'm not a big tanker stock maniac, but I see the logic now for this particular era in time. And if this whole thing with because the inflation story is not over and done with yet. I think we're just maybe in the middle of it at best, but it's more like, feels like it's actually 1/3 when I listen to what economists are talking about 2025 being the end of it, and they start bringing down the interest rates. So I think this situation will be going on for some time now. And I think oil prices will continue to zigzag or maybe even head down. I think what OPEC came to a conclusion with is basically agreeing that there's a demand problem rather than a supply issue. And that's a serious situation to face.
Excellent. Well, thank you both, gentlemen. Everybody, please follow TankerTrackers, follow Sal, go to Sal's YouTube channel, and follow Place Your Trades, of course, to see what else we have going on over there. And don't forget, I'll put the link in my stream as soon as this Spaces is over for the PDF. Go and sign up for that, so you'll get it emailed tomorrow. And thank you, everybody, for attending. Again, thank you, gentlemen, for spending time with us today. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to be with us. And I guess that's it. And I'll see everybody next Wednesday.
Our pleasure, Tracy. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Tracy. Thank you so much.